Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for joining me once again. Tonight, we're heading deep into the heart of the Arctic, a place so cold, so vast, and so unforgiving that few ever return. This is the story of the Jeannette expedition of 1881, an American crew trapped in the frozen seas north of Siberia, facing months of darkness, hunger, and impossible odds. But this isn't just a story of tragedy. It's a story of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable will to survive, even when the world itself turns to ice. So grab your blanket, settle in, and let's journey back into the white silence, where the human spirit was tested like never before. It began with a dream wrapped in frost and glory. In the late 19th century, the Arctic was more than a place. It was a myth. The newspapers called it the crown of the earth, and every empire wanted its flag to pierce that untouched white silence. Britain had tried for decades and lost ships, men, and hope. The Franklin expedition had vanished into ice and legend, but now America wanted its turn. Lieutenant George Washington DeLong, a man of calm command and relentless curiosity, believed he could succeed where others had perished. The Arctic, he thought, was not chaos. It was a pattern waiting to be understood, and through that understanding he would find the North Pole. His ship, the USS Jeannette, was a former British Royal Navy vessel, reinforced, refitted and braced with extra oak and iron to face the crushing ice. It was small by modern standards, barely 140 feet long, but she carried the pride of a nation and the ambitions of an age. DeLong was no reckless dreamer. He was a man who planned in layers, charts, rations, contingency upon contingency, yet even he could not foresee how utterly indifferent the Arctic would be to human logic. On the clear morning of July 8, 1879, the Jeannette slipped away from the Mare Island Navy Yard, her black hull glistening, her flags fluttering in the Pacific breeze. Crowds gathered along the docks to wave goodbye. Journalists jotted notes, families shouted farewells. For many aboard, it might have felt like a grand adventure, not a farewell to life. The expedition carried 33 men, sailors, engineers, scientists, and 2 Inuit dog handlers. They represented the best of American optimism, bound together by one impossible mission: to find an open sea beyond the Arctic ice, a route to the pole that some scientists insisted existed. Among them was Chief Engineer George Melville, an ingenious mechanic whose determination would one day define the expedition's survival. There was also Dr. James Ambler, a quiet, capable surgeon who packed his medical chest with quinine bandages and faith. And there was Jerome Collins, a young Irish meteorologist and journalist full of hope and bravado who had left behind a fiancée in New York. Each man signed his name on the Navy roster, a contract with courage, though none could imagine how terrible the test would be. DeLong's mission rested on a theory already fraying under scrutiny, that north of Siberia lay a warm, navigable, open polar sea. Warm currents, some scientists claimed, flowed beneath the ice, creating a hidden ocean free from frost. If a ship could reach that zone, it might sail straight to the pole. The theory had been proposed by German cartographers, endorsed by American journalists, and funded by one of the richest men in the country, James Gordon Bennett Jr., the flamboyant publisher of the New York Herald. Bennett wanted glory, headlines, and history. The Herald had already sponsored Stanley's search for Dr. Livingstone in Africa. Now, Bennett wanted the Arctic. "Find the pole, Mr. DeLong," Bennett had said, "and the world will remember you and my paper." The Jeannette followed the Pacific northward, past Alaska's jagged coastlines into the narrowing throat of the Bering Strait. The seas grew colder, the gulls thinned. Ice began to appear in patches, white slabs drifting in silence, harbingers of what awaited them. DeLong wrote in his journal, "The sea seems to breathe cold. Each mile northward feels like another step away from the known world." The ship's boilers thumped, and the men worked constantly, trimming sails, tending engines, taking soundings. They stopped briefly at St. Lawrence Bay on the Siberian coast to take on coal and supplies. Local Chukchi tribespeople watched the strange foreign ship and warned them of ice without end. DeLong smiled politely but pressed on. He trusted his charts, his instruments, and his own resolve. He had studied the Arctic winds, the sea currents, the drift of ice. He believed knowledge could conquer nature, but the Arctic, silent and endless, was already watching them. Life on the Jeannette was cramped, loud and disciplined. Below decks, the air smelled of coal smoke, oil and damp wool. The men shared narrow bunks and worked in shifts, steering, shoveling coal, tending engines or recording scientific data. DeLong demanded order, but also morale. He allowed music in the evenings, a fiddle, an accordion, and the deep hum of men's voices singing shanties that spoke of warmer seas. They celebrated small holidays with makeshift feasts. The surgeon Ambler organised lectures on astronomy and anatomy. The ice might soon cage them, but for now, they lived like explorers, confident and alive. They carried with them the most advanced navigation tools of their time: sextants, barometers, thermometers, chronometers, and DeLong insisted on recording every observation. He envisioned his expedition as both a conquest and a contribution to science. By early September, as they approached Wrangel Island, the northern winds sharpened, the sea grew restless. One night, the lookout shouted, "Ice ahead!" and a faint white wall emerged in the mist. DeLong climbed to the deck and stared. Before them lay a frozen plain stretching to the horizon, the pack ice. It was early in the season for such dense ice. The crew gathered at the rails, watching floes grind together with the groan of shifting mountains. DeLong hesitated. He knew that to wait meant losing valuable time. The polar summer was fading fast. But to proceed was to gamble everything. He chose to push north. The Jeannette nosed her way into a lead, a narrow channel of open water between the ice fields. The engines roared, the ship shuddered, and the ice closed behind her like a door. By September 5th, 1879, the Jeannette was frozen fast, locked in an immovable grip. DeLong stood on deck, the silence pressing in. The ship creaked, the ice groaned, and the Arctic night began to fall. They had crossed into another world, a world of endless white, endless cold, and endless waiting. He gathered the men in the mess hall and spoke calmly. "Gentlemen, the Jeannette will winter here. We are well supplied. We will conduct our work as planned. Come spring, the ice will release us. Until then, we remain steadfast and united." The men cheered, some with genuine faith, others with the forced enthusiasm of denial. None yet knew that the ice would never release them. For the next 2 years, their world would shrink to a ship buried in ice, drifting, creaking, slowly being crushed by a frozen ocean that obeyed no human will. And thus, the dream of glory faded into the long silence of the Arctic night. The Arctic does not crush quickly. It tightens its grip by degrees, slow, patient, merciless. By mid-September 1879, the USS Jeannette was locked solid within a shifting white labyrinth. The ship's hull groaned under pressure, as if the sea itself were alive, breathing cold fury into the timbers. The temperature plunged to 30 degrees below zero. Winds howled through the rigging. The ice cracked and thundered beneath them like artillery. At first, the men tried to treat it as a temporary inconvenience. They shoveled snow from the decks, kept the boilers stoked, and told each other that spring would bring thaw and freedom. But the Arctic has no sympathy for human calendars. The ice held them, drifted them, and made them its own. DeLong, methodical as ever, refused despair. He reorganised the ship into a floating outpost of discipline and duty. Each man was assigned a daily schedule: work, exercise, study, and rest. The ship's carpenter, William Cole, built partitions and reinforced beams to resist the pressure. The engineer, George Melville, maintained the engines in working order, though there was nowhere left to go. The doctor, James Ambler, insisted they maintain hygiene and morale. Men die faster from hopelessness than hunger, he reminded them. He distributed lime juice to fight scurvy and tobacco to soothe nerves. The sailors built snow walls around the ship for insulation. They created tunnels leading to makeshift storehouses. In the evenings, they lit oil lamps, played music, and read aloud from battered novels. When the lamps flickered low, the Arctic outside glowed faintly blue beneath the ghostly shimmer of the aurora. Some nights, the men climbed onto the ice and watched the northern lights ripple across the sky, green curtains waving in silence as if the heavens themselves mocked their small firelit world. Jerome Collins, the Irish meteorologist, kept a diary. "The ship is our island in an endless desert. The wind carries voices, the creak of the ice, the moan of pressure ridges. It feels like the earth itself is restless. Even in confinement, DeLong turned hardship into purpose. He ordered the men to continue their scientific observations, measuring air temperatures, charting magnetic variation, recording the drift of the ice. The Jeannette, though trapped, still moved, slowly, silently, drifting westward with the frozen ocean. DeLong realised that the pack ice was carrying them toward unknown Siberian waters. The dream of the North Pole was gone, but now he saw a chance for discovery of another kind, to chart the hidden currents of the Arctic. Each day, they recorded the position by celestial observation, a task that grew harder as daylight faded to a few dim hours. By November, the sun was gone, the polar night had begun, 24 hours of darkness stretching for months. The lamps burned constantly, frost gathered inside their cabins, breath froze on beards and eyelashes. The men's world shrank to a few glowing rooms, surrounded by deathly cold. Isolation began to weigh heavily. Voices grew sharper, patience thinner. Some men whispered of bad luck, of omens. Others turned inward, silent and hollow-eyed. DeLong knew morale was as fragile as glass. He scheduled routines obsessively, even cheerful dinners on Sundays. He led prayers in the mess hall and toasted their loved ones back home. When Christmas came, they celebrated as best they could. They decorated the mess with scraps of coloured paper. The cook baked a small pudding from flour and raisins. Melville played the accordion while the men sang carols off-key, laughter echoing strangely against the creaking hull. It was brief, defiant joy, humanity flickering in the heart of a frozen void. By January, the ice began to move again. The temperature dropped 60 below zero. Sudden cracks thundered through the darkness as pressure ridges rose around the ship, jagged walls of ice forcing themselves upward like frozen volcanoes. One night, the hull shuddered violently. Men leapt from their bunks as timbers groaned and bolts popped. The deck tilted. Ice had crushed part of the starboard bow. "Axes, men!" Melville shouted. "We'll hack her free." For hours they laboured in the freezing gale, hacking at the ice, shovelling snow, pouring hot water around the hull to ease the pressure. Fingers froze to tools. Frostbite claimed a few toes. When dawn came, a dim, bluish smear on the horizon, the Jeannette still stood, battered but intact. They had won a small victory, but the ice was patient. As the endless night dragged on, dreams and memories began to blend. Some men spoke aloud to absent wives or children. Others wrote letters they would never send. Jerome Collins grew increasingly quiet, filling page after page in his journal. One entry read, "I dreamed of rain tonight. The sound of it on a roof. Imagine rain. What a strange luxury warmth seems Dr. Ambler began noticing signs of exhaustion and depression. He treated frostbite, scurvy and insomnia. He rationed their dwindling spirits as carefully as their food. And through it all, DeLong remained unyielding, calm, precise, encouraging. His logbooks remained meticulous, his handwriting steady even as the ink froze in the bottle. In one entry he wrote, "The ice teaches humility. Each creak of timber reminds me we are guests here. Tolerated, not welcome." In March 1880, the first faint light returned, a thin dawn that lingered longer each day. The men rejoiced, imagining spring and release. The ice cracked and shifted. Channels of water appeared, but the relief was cruelly brief. The ice closed again, harder than before, and snow buried the decks in silence. The men learned the Arctic's first lesson. Hope was as dangerous as despair. As summer approached, the Jeannette still lay trapped, but she was drifting. Instruments showed they had moved hundreds of miles west, deeper into uncharted seas north of Siberia. The world knew nothing of their position. They had become ghosts carried by the currents toward an uncertain fate. Still, DeLong clung to optimism. He told the crew, "The ice will let us go in its own time. Until then, we endure," and they did endure, through hunger, cold, fear and silence, never realising that the worst was yet to come. The Arctic was not done with them, not by far. By the winter of 1880, the Jeannette had been frozen for over a year. The ship was no longer a vessel, but a wooden island entombed in glittering ice. Everything groaned, creaked and shifted with the slow violence of nature's crushing weight. When the men climbed the masts to scan the horizon, they saw only one thing: white. An endless, unbroken horizon of snow and broken ridges of ice stretching to the edge of the sky. It was as if the world had been erased, and they were the last men alive to remember it. The second Arctic winter came harder than the first. The cold deepened until even metal tools shattered in their hands. Frost thickened on walls and blankets until it fell in shimmering flakes each time someone moved. The ship's timbers were cracking audibly now, bending beneath tons of pressure. At night, the sound of grinding ice surrounded them, the eerie, thunderous roar of the pack shifting miles wide. Sometimes a jagged ridge would rise from the ocean floor, towering above the deck like a frozen mountain, groaning as if alive. DeLong, unshaken, still recorded every sound, every change of wind, every temperature. He would not surrender the mission to despair. But privately, he knew the Jeannette was living on borrowed time. The crew's daily routine became mechanical, a way to hold back madness. They hunted for seals when cracks opened in the ice, shot polar bears when they could, and rationed the dwindling stores of food. Each morning, Dr. Ambler made rounds through the icy corridors, checking for frostbite and scurvy. His hands were cracked and bleeding, but he remained calm, a quiet pillar of compassion amid suffering. In the galley, the cook's fire sputtered and smoked. "I can't make warmth out of frost," he muttered. Meals became thinner. Biscuit, salt pork, tinned soup. Some nights they melted snow for water, flavoured faintly with rust from the pipes. The engineer Melville stayed below deck, tending to engines that would never turn again. He polished the brass and oiled the gears out of pure stubborn pride. "A ship deserves dignity," he said once, "even when she's dying." Jerome Collins, the journalist, still kept his log. His handwriting wavered now, lines cramped from the cold. He wrote, "The men are weary. Our laughter sounds brittle like breaking glass. The ice sighs and moans as if mocking us, yet none complain aloud. That's the strange strength of sailors. We just keep breathing, waiting." On the night of June 11th, 1881, the end came suddenly. The air was still, the temperature hovering near freezing. DeLong was in his cabin writing in the logbook when a deafening crack split the silence. The deck lurched. Men shouted. A deep rumbling filled the hull, the sound of a world tearing apart. "On deck!" DeLong roared. They burst into the open as the ship tilted violently to port. A massive ice ridge had driven itself beneath the hull. The masts bent like reeds. The main beam snapped with a sound like a cannon blast. Within minutes, water began pouring through the shattered planks. The Jeannette groaned, a living creature in its death throes. "Abandon ship!" Melville bellowed. The men scrambled to save what they could. Sleds, tents, rifles, food, logbooks, charts. The cold water froze instantly around their boots. The hull cracked again, splintering with finality. By dawn, the Jeannette was gone, swallowed whole by the Arctic Sea. Only splintered wood and drifting debris marked the place where she had stood defiant for 2 long years. DeLong stood on the ice, staring at the open water, the empty horizon. His journal entry that day read simply, "June 12th, ship gone, all hands safe. Our fate is in God's hands now." They were now 23 men stranded on the shifting ice floes, hundreds of miles from land, with only what they could drag on sledges. Their goal? To reach the new Siberian islands, and from there, the Siberian mainland. They had no path, no reliable maps, and no guarantee the ice would hold. Every step was a gamble. The crew fashioned 3 sled boats from the ship's remains, half sled, half lifeboat, each loaded with gear and supplies. They harnessed themselves to the ropes like beasts of burden and began their trek across the white wilderness. The going was brutal. Ice ridges rose like walls before them, some 20 feet high. They hacked and climbed for hours just to move a mile. The sun reflected blindingly off the snow, burning their eyes. Their hands froze around the ropes. When they found flat ice, they dragged for hours in silence, the only sound the crunch of boots and the groan of sled runners. When the ice cracked beneath them, they scrambled for their lives, pulling the boats across floating slabs, praying they wouldn't fall into the black water below. Each day, DeLong recorded their drift and position, though the compass grew unreliable. The men trusted him utterly. His calmness, held them together. Melville took charge of building camps and rationing fuel. He melted snow over tiny stoves, made tea from seal fat, and taught the men to sleep in pairs for warmth. Dr. Ambler's medical supplies were almost gone. He treated frostbite with blubber oil and wrapped blackened fingers in rags. "You'll live," he said to one man who had lost 2 toes, "so long as you keep moving." They buried their dead in shallow snow graves when exhaustion claimed them. DeLong would bow his head, whispering the Lord's Prayer, and then order the march to resume. There was no time to grieve. Weeks passed. The ice shifted beneath them, carrying them ever westward. Food grew scarce. Even the dogs were weak. They shot what seals they could, but most nights they went to sleep hungry. Then, in late July, they saw it. Dark shapes on the horizon, the new Siberian islands, real land. The men wept openly. Some knelt in the snow and crossed themselves. They were still over 200 miles from the mainland, but it was hope. Solid, visible, undeniable. They hacked a camp from the ice and waited for a chance to cross open water. When cracks widened and leads appeared between floes, they launched their boats. For the first time in 2 years, they floated on a liquid sea, but it was not mercy they found. Waves tossed their fragile craft. Icebergs crashed around them. The men rowed through freezing spray, hands blistered, faces crusted with salt. When fog rolled in, they could see nothing but grey. Still, they pushed forward through exhaustion, hunger and fear. Each day brought new hope and new loss. For weeks, the men had trudged across a labyrinth of ice, dragging their boats like crucifixes across a white desert. The Jeannette was gone, buried under tons of frozen sea, but her crew lived on. 23 human sparks defying extinction. The appearance of open water in early August 1881 was both a salvation and a curse. It meant freedom from the endless grind of ice, but also the beginning of a new danger. The Arctic Ocean, vast and merciless, filled with drifting icebergs and violent squalls. DeLong divided the crew into 3 boats. The first boat, commanded by himself, carried Dr. Ambler, Seaman Alexei, and several others. The second boat, under Chief Engineer George Melville, was the sturdiest, holding a compass and most of the navigational tools. The third boat, led by Lieutenant Chip, carried 12 men, the largest of the groups, but with the most fragile craft. They launched from a ragged edge of ice, the air heavy with fog, and the sea black as oil. For the first time in 2 years, the men could hear the water lapping freely against wood, a sound both strange and terrifying. DeLong gave his final orders before departure. "We keep together as best we can. If separated, we make for the leaner delta. That is our only hope of salvation." He clasped Melville's hand, then Chip's. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "tell the world we did our duty." Then the boats pushed off, their sails catching a faint wind, their oars dipping into the Arctic Sea. Behind them, the ice drifted like a graveyard of ghosts. For 2 days, the sea remained calm. The men rowed steadily, their hands blistered and raw, keeping the 3 boats in sight of one another. They ate meagre rations of seal meat and biscuits soaked in brine, drank melted ice water, and huddled beneath oilskins to rest. But on the 3rd day, the wind changed. A low growl came from the west, the voice of a rising storm. The sky darkened and the sea began to churn. Snow whipped across the waves. Within hours, the boats were being tossed like driftwood. "Batten down!" DeLong shouted. His voice was nearly swallowed by the wind. The waves towered higher than houses, breaking over the bows. Freezing spray turned to ice on the rigging, adding deadly weight. Through the chaos, the men could see flashes of the other boats, faint silhouettes between waves. Melville's boat still held course, but Chip's, lighter and slower, was struggling behind. As night fell, visibility dropped to nothing. The men clung to the thwarts, eyes blinded by sleet. DeLong yelled through the storm, "Hold the line, keep together." But nature had other plans. A massive wave struck broadside, spinning DeLong's boat. When he regained control, the others were gone. Only blackness surrounded them. Black sky, black sea, black despair. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a terrible stillness. Ice floated in every direction, glittering beneath the weak Arctic sun. The men called out across the water, hoping to hear an answering shout. None came. The Jeannette's crew was now divided, 3 boats, each adrift, alone, and hundreds of miles from safety. Lieutenant Chip's boat was never seen again. No wreckage, no bodies, no trace of its 12 souls were ever found. They vanished into the sea sometime during the storm, perhaps swamped by a wave, perhaps frozen as the cold turned the water to slush. In his journal, DeLong later wrote, "God rest them. Brave men all. Their courage was without complaint, their faith steadfast. The sea has taken them into its silence. DeLong's own boat fared little better. With only a few provisions left, they pressed onward toward the Lena Delta, the vast river mouth in Siberia, where salvation might await. They battled ice floes that blocked their way, forcing them to haul the boat across frozen ridges at night, rowing by day through bitter winds. Their hands were cracked to the bone, their lips bled from salt and cold. Each man moved as if in a trance, powered only by instinct and DeLong's unbreakable will. On September 12th, after weeks of struggle, they sighted land, the outermost islands of the Lena Delta. Cheers broke out among the men, some wept. DeLong knelt briefly, whispering a prayer. They had made it to the threshold of safety, but nature's cruelty was not yet spent. The Lena Delta was not the refuge they had imagined. It was a maze of marshes, sandbars, and frozen channels stretching for hundreds of miles. With winter fast approaching, the water froze almost overnight. They were trapped again, this time on solid land, but with no food, no shelter, and no knowledge of which way led to civilization. The men were starving. They shot one last bird for food, a small snipe that provided barely a mouthful each. DeLong divided it evenly, ensuring every man received his share. "We will march south," he said. "The river must lead us to life." They packed what little they had, a few rifles, a compass, scraps of maps, and began the final march. Miles to the east, Melville's boat had also reached land. His group was in better shape, though battered by cold and exhaustion. By some miracle, they had landed on a different branch of the Lena Delta, closer to native settlements. Melville, ever the engineer, quickly organised shelter and scavenged for food. He sent 2 men inland to seek help, and when they returned with word of villages nearby, he knew what he must do. He would go back into the wilderness to find DeLong. Before setting out, Melville wrote in his log, "The captain is out there. I cannot rest while he is missing. The Lena Delta is a graveyard of ice, but if he still breathes, I will find him." He gathered a small rescue team and pushed north into the freezing storm. The Arctic winter had arrived with full vengeance. Blizzards howled like a living creature, and daylight shrank to a few grey hours. For DeLong and his 11 surviving men, salvation was now measured not in miles, but in breaths. When they left their boat behind on the delta's edge, it was mid-September 1881. The temperature had already dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius, and snow fell in heavy, choking waves. The men trudged south, following the frozen branches of the Lena River, hoping to find a settlement, any sign of human life. DeLong led from the front, gaunt and frostbitten, his once neat uniform reduced to rags. Behind him stumbled Dr. Ambler, quietly keeping an eye on the weakest men, offering encouragement in whispers. "Just a few more steps," he'd murmur. "Keep moving." Warmth is in motion, but warmth was a lie. The wind stripped heat from their bodies. Faster than their hearts could replace it, their boots cracked, their fingers blackened. Each day another man fell behind, first Ninderman, then Eriksson, then Alexei, their native hunter. Alexei's death hit DeLong the hardest. He had been their provider, the one who could find game even in the cruelest wastes. When he collapsed, the others carried him for half a day before DeLong finally stopped. He looked at the lifeless face of the man who had once kept them alive and said simply, "We go on." He would have wanted that they buried Alexei in the snow, marking the spot with a makeshift cross of driftwood. Then they marched again, slower now, quieter. The Arctic had begun to claim them one by one. Meanwhile, George Melville and his men, having found safety among Yakut villages farther south, refused to rest. They had food, warmth, and the mercy of civilization, but Melville could not enjoy it. He saw DeLong's face in every flicker of firelight. He assembled a small rescue team, 2 Yakut guides and 2 sailors. With sleds, dogs, and supplies, they headed back north into the storm. Locals warned him it was suicide. The river was freezing solid, and the winds could strip flesh from bone, but Melville only replied, "He saved my life once. Now it's my turn." For weeks he pushed through white voids, following faint traces, footprints buried by snow, scraps of canvas, a frozen biscuit tin. At one abandoned camp, he found a logbook page in DeLong's handwriting, the ink blurred but legible. Still moving south. Spirits good. Food nearly gone. Melville tucked the page into his coat, his jaw tightening. They were alive, he muttered. They were alive. By early October, DeLong's group could go no farther. They found a patch of raised ground, a small island amid the delta's icy channels. There, DeLong ordered a halt. Their rations were gone. The last piece of bread had been eaten days before, the last bird weeks earlier. They chewed on scraps of leather, melted ice for water, and tried to sleep through the pain in their bellies. Still, DeLong refused despair. Every morning, he took out his journal and wrote, his handwriting weaker but precise. October 1st, we are resting, the wind is fierce. Ambler tending the men, I feel the strength leaving me. October 2nd, I have ordered the men to conserve matches, we pray. October 4th, we can go no further, God's will be done. The entries continued until October 30th. The final words in his journal read, no food, we wait for death. May God have mercy on our souls. It was nearly 8 months later, in March 1882, when Melville's search party stumbled upon a small rise of snow marked by a stick and a rag fluttering weakly in the wind. They dug. Under the first drift, they found the frozen form of a man still sitting upright, rifle across his knees, eyes closed as if in prayer. It was DeLong. Beside him lay Dr. Ambler and the rest of the crew, huddled together, some holding each other's hands, others wrapped in their torn coats. They had died slowly, peacefully, without panic, faithful to the very end. Melville dropped to his knees in the snow. He took off his gloves and pressed his bare hand to DeLong's shoulder. I found you, Captain, he whispered. I kept my word. He buried them where they lay, building a cairn of stones and driftwood. Over it he placed a wooden cross, carved with the words, Here lie the officers and men of the Jeannette, died in the performance of duty. When Melville finally returned to the United States in 1884 with DeLong's journals, the nation was shaken. The expedition's tragedy was recounted in every newspaper, but so too was its courage, its loyalty, its unbroken spirit. Congress awarded medals of honor to the surviving crew. Melville continued his naval service, designing ice-strengthened ships and advocating for safer polar exploration. The Jeannette story became a symbol of endurance, not of failure, but of what it means to stand against nature and not yield. Decades later, fragments of the Jeannette, a nameplate, a wooden spar, were found drifting off Greenland, carried thousands of miles by the polar currents. Those relics prove something incredible. The Arctic Ocean was not a frozen continent, but a sea, a discovery that would shape exploration for generations. And somewhere beneath the endless snow of the Lena Delta, DeLong and his men still rest, guardians of the Arctic silence. Their courage, written in ice and wind, remains one of the most poignant stories of human endurance ever told.